2. I'm Chris Motes, and this is Faith in Politics. On this broadcast, we range from the soul to the state as we cultivate those virtues and explore those principles that help us live well as faithful Catholics in this great land. Well, welcome back for another episode, folks. Spring is in the air. We are through the legislative session, save for veto day. The legislature has a little bit of work left to wrap up to consider any gubernatorial vetoes that may be forthcoming in the days ahead, as well as to return to their very important work of consideration of impeachment of the Attorney General relating around a car accident in which a pedestrian sadly lost his life the other year. So they're going to be returning to Pier later in the month to take up those issues. In the meantime, we are happy to be returning to you with another episode of Faith in Politics. As I announced on this program last week, I am transitioning out of this work, which I have just been delighted to do for the last 5 legislative sessions, taking a job I'm really excited about, serving as Chief of Staff for Bishop DeGroote and the Bishop of the Diocese of Sioux Falls. We'll be continuing on as an advisor to the South Dakota Catholic Conference for the foreseeable future. One of the, of course, important things that needs to happen is we need to hire a new director. So if you know somebody that's got a heart for the church, loves the Lord and loves the church, and also has got a real heart for their country, understands law and politics, and is just really interested in that, one of the things that, going back 6 years now, that I came to realize about myself when I was practicing law in a small town, doing a lot of estate planning and elder law, I was going home at night, and after the kids were in bed, I wasn't reading books about how to be a better estate planner. Of course, I did want to be excellent in my profession, but I found myself reading the church's social doctrine and like reading, encyclicals about the church's moral teaching in the world. And this was like really strangely exciting for me. And then I came to know maybe there's something else in store for me, which led me to the Catholic Conference work later in that year. As I said, really delightful for the last 5 years. So if you know somebody that's like that, feel free. They can go to our website, sdcatholicconference.org, and find a link to the job. Share with loved ones. We'll be looking forward to finding a great candidate to fill the position of executive director. Okay, so our episode today, what's the problem? We're going to talk about the problem of evil. Returning as a guest to this program has been a frequent contributor in the past, Dr. John Schaff, professor of government and director of the Center for Public History and Civic Engagement at Northern State University in Aberdeen, South Dakota. Professor Schaff is the author of many fine books and articles. We have had many great conversations on this program in the past, including on, I think, maybe one of our first earlier conversations, a book he wrote called Abraham Lincoln's Statesmanship and the Limits of Liberal Democracy. Talked a little bit about Abraham Lincoln and Leo XIII's social doctrine. Also had conversations, great talks about City of God, Augustine. We're going to just mention a little bit of Augustine in our conversation today. Dr. Schaff, welcome back to Faith in Politics.
Thanks for having me. I think the last time I was on, didn't we talk about just war theory?
We did.
I think that was the last time. That's in the news these days.
That is. And I was just...
so people could go back and find that one on the podcast site.
That's a great point. I'm going to maybe throw that one up on our Twitter too so people can find it a little bit quicker. If you're on Twitter, you can find it us at SDCatholicCon. And I'll throw a link. That'd be a great one to return to. Yeah, so we've a lot of great topics. When you threw this one out, problem of evil, my first reaction was like, yes, let's talk about that, because this is like one of those basic problems that just sort of resounds in every human heart at some point in a person's life. Maybe you've suffered violence at the hands of another. Of course, that's or just suffering, the loss of love. It's so many different ways in which this can come up in a human heart. And of course, because it's a human problem, we could in many ways describe it as a political problem too. So a very apt, appropriate topic for faith and politics. So maybe just to get us started, Dr. Schaff, what's the problem? What's the problem of evil?
So the problem of evil is this, sometimes known as the problem of theodicy, God's justice. Theo, God, DK, justice. There's your Greek lesson for the day. Don't poke me too much on that, because I've almost exhausted my knowledge of ancient Greek right there. But but God, how can there be a just God in a world with evil? How do we reconcile evil with God's justice? And the basic problem is this: is that if there's a God who is all powerful, all knowing, and all good, why is there evil in the world? Wouldn't an all powerful, all knowing, all good God, omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent God, create a world without suffering? We look out in the world, we existentially know that there is suffering. How do we reconcile those two things? So even though in the Summa, when Thomas is considering arguments against God's existence, he actually says the only argument that he takes really seriously is this argument. It is the kind of thing that sort of can rock people's faith that either there is a God, or at least a God as the church understands God, right? It undermines our faith in that God, because how can I reconcile this God who we say God is love, God is omnipotent, God is all powerful, God is all knowing? How can I reconcile with this, with
right,
all the suffering I see around me, both natural suffering and human cruelty, these sorts of things? So how do we reconcile those things?
Yeah, and it seems to me too that, I mean, you mentioned Aquinas as recognizing this is a stronger argument. He's taken it seriously. Even today, atheists, this will be an argument that they advance, that you'll hear from, the atheists that are out there on the internet, social media, et cetera. So it's certainly
It's out there.
Yes, it's not a new problem, and it's not a question that's going away either. So, one of the important aspects, or kind of historically, we've talked about Augustine in the past, back to the City of God earlier, and I think this is episode 14 and 19. I just looked it up. We did a 2-part series if anybody wants to go back and listen to it. So during Augustine's time, there were these people, this group of thinkers, believers, a sect, the Manichaeans, if I remember right. And they had some very particular thoughts about good and evil. They understood evil in a particular way. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. And the text you'd want to go to on this is not really City of God, but you'd want to go to Confessions, wouldn't you?
Sure.
Because in Augustine's Confessions, which is the story of Augustine's conversion, Augustine was a Manichaean. At one point. It's sort of his first step from unbelief to belief is into the Manichaean sect. And so within Augustine's Confessions, he has this discourse on what is the nature of evil. And so the Manichaean heresy is that there are these two competing forces in the cosmos. There is good and there is evil. And evil is sort of the separate entity that has a force of its own. And so there's this light and dark, good and evil, that are in combat with itself. Even we use the term sometimes if a person has a Manichaean outlook on things. It's someone who sees the world in black and white. There is good and there is evil, and never the twain shall meet. And so what Augustine starts to realize as he starts to break away from the Manichaeans, and he gets drawn into the church for various reasons, not worth going into now, but under the under the influence of Ambrose, he's pulled into the church. He starts to realize that if God is good, all of creation is good.
Yes,
there is no separate thing, separate force, separate entity called evil. And so what is evil? Evil, he starts to believe, is not a thing in of itself, but a privation of the good. It's the absence of the good. So evil in this sense is a lacking. It's an absence, right? Not a thing in and of itself, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you've used this word force. I mean, can we do pop culture for a minute? Is this Star Wars? We've got the dark side. Is the presentation of these competing forces, if you will, is it have a bit of a Manichaean outlook?
Yeah, and so I mean, how do we resolve this? If people can look up somewhere out there, the great Peter Kreeft, the philosopher Peter Kreeft. Remember, it's pronounced Kreeft, but it looks like Kreeft if you're looking for it.
Yeah.
Kreeft
Yes.
has a talk. I'm sure people can find it on YouTube or on. He's got I think an iTunes channel. You can find his podcasts. A lot of his talks are in podcast form. He's got one on the philosophy of Star Wars.
Okay.
And what he points out, one way to deal with the problem of evil is kind of the Buddhist way, kind of an Eastern way, which is to say evil isn't real, that the entire material world is really a fantasy. And so the way we escape this is through meditation. We come to realize that we are all participating in Atman, Brahman, whatever you want to call we are all God.
Yeah.
And that what evil is the distance between our desires, right? All these worldly desires and the reality that all this is an illusion.
Yep.
And that brings about suffering. You see some of that in Star Wars, actually.
Yep.
Let go, as Obi-Wan whispers in Luke's ear as he's about to destroy the Death Star. Maybe this reveals too much Star Wars geekdom on my part. I don't know. That I can quote lines. But anyhow, but then also this idea that there's a dark side and a light side of the Force, right? And that they are in competition with each other, almost like a zero-sum game. As one grows, the other must retreat, and vice versa. And there's some element of truth in this, in that we all, Solzhenitsyn's line of the line between good and evil goes down the line of every man's soul. So there's some truth to that, but this idea, I mean, with the Force, if there's a dark side to the Force, there's this thing. But what Augustine's saying is no, evil is not a force. It's not an entity. It's not this thing in and of itself. And the way to explain this, I'll steal gratuitously from a Benedictine philosopher, Herbert McCabe. This is how he describes. He's got these. What I like about McCabe on this is that he's got these very homey examples that really drives it home. He thinks about what he says. Well, what makes a good deck chair, right? And we can all think about what makes a good deck chair, and it'll be different. I want it to recline. I need a cup holder. I like mine to be cushioned.
Yeah.
Right. I need a footrest. Right. These sorts of things. And then we think about what makes a bad deck chair is we start talking about things that are lacking in the deck chair. Even know what makes a grape a good grape. Oh, I want it to be crisp but not dried out. I want it to be juicy. I don't want it to be mushy. When we start talking about bad grapes, it's things the grape is lacking. Right?
It's lacking in sweetness.
Yes, it's lacking in sweetness. People don't like it when your grapes get old and they get a little mushy, right?
Yeah.
They don't like that consistency, right? It's lacking in crispness.
Yeah.
And so what makes a good grape and a good deck chair are not the same thing, right? Good grapes and good deck chairs aren't. So, but there is an idea of goodness, but there's also when we talk about what makes a bad deck chair and a bad grape is something is missing, right?
Yeah.
And that's a way of getting at this idea that when evil is occurring, it's not that evil is a thing in and of itself, but it is absence of good qualities, right? We're failing to live up.
And what's coming to mind for me right now is Lucifer's fall from heaven, following his creation. Within the sort of classical tradition, his words as he fell were non serviam, I will not serve. Mm-hmm. So maybe in that way, what we can understand is what is lacking is his allegiance to God, his willingness to serve God.
Yep. So in Milton, in Milton's Paradise Lost, what does he say about Lucifer? He would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven.
Yes.
And I guess he gets his just rewards for that attitude.
So just to recap that point is we can't really understand evil as its own independent force with its own essence. What it is, it's an absence of the good. It's an absence of a positive quality.
It's not something that God created.
Yeah.
Right? God didn't create this thing called evil, or it doesn't come from some other thing. Like there's some other God out there, an evil God who's creating evil. What God created was all good. And so when we experience evil after the fall, right, now there are deprivations. There are deprivations from the good, and some of those are natural deprivations. Why are there earthquakes? Why does lightning strike sometimes? Why do lions eat gazelles? That sort of thing. And then there's moral evil.
Yes.
Right. So why is there natural? Why do some people get cancer? That's a natural evil.
Yes.
And then there's moral evil. Why do people do bad things? Why is there cruelty in the world? And so those are two different kinds of evils that we might want to discuss.
Can we take a quick diversion into Protestant theology? Sure. And if you're not, so I have in my mind that there's one of the Protestant reformers, I don't know if it was Calvin or Luther or who, but has this description of humans as sort of the dunghill that through God's grace covered with snow. Can we actually also say that this is an incorrect understanding of God's creation of human beings? If they're describing us as, even in our fallen nature, describing us as a dunghill, is that an incorrect? Any comment there?
Yeah, there's original sin separates us from God.
Yes.
Right.
Correct.
But God's creation is good, right? And so we are not completely separated from God's goodness, right? We are created good. It is good that God created us, and that's why we're redeemable. Why does God want to redeem us?
Yes.
And so we still have this capacity in us to know God, to know the good, the true, the beautiful. And so there's not this total depravity as some reformers would have had it, that there's still something there that there's enough goodness left in me that I can know God and recognize my sinfulness and recognize the goodness of the world around me. Even the natural world can be something that gives me an indication that there is goodness. And there's enough left in me that I can recognize that. Enough goodness left in me that I can recognize that.
Gotcha. Okay, so stepping back into this distinction between a natural evil and a moral evil. So natural evil would be like the tornado which destroyed my house and caused much suffering in my life. The moral evil being there was a betrayal within a marriage and great suffering that results of, from infidelity. We could think of many different examples. Mm-hmm. I think, I think for many people today, it's maybe, we see a link of suffering between these two, but is it just me? Do we have a hard time describing a tornado as evil? It just sort of happens. What's the link between these two? And help me understand both of these a little bit more.
Well, okay, I think think about natural evils like COVID is a natural. It's not good. It's something that happens and it's bad, right? People get COVID. Some people die of COVID, right? That's bad. Any illness is that way.
Yeah.
So we think of, why does this 4-year-old have leukemia?
Yeah.
Why is that? Now, here, there are two ways to approach this. Even think of something like, disease. When someone gets cancer, the cancer is actually doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. So in that sense, it's good for the cancer. It's bad for you. Same as, when the lion eats the gazelle, good for the lion, bad for the gazelle.
Yeah.
Part of this is the consequence of living in a material world. Again, I think this is probably the Buddhist error, is to try to say the material world is an illusion, is a fantasy.
Yeah.
But no, the material world is here. And the nature of a material world is decay.
Yeah.
Is to it's even it's law of thermodynamics, entropy is to tend towards disorder.
Yes.
And so nothing in a material world is going to last forever. So to a certain extent, to say we don't like what I'm calling natural evil is to say I don't like a material world.
Yes.
Right. It just sort of goes along with having a body. Other life forms in the world have to live, And in this sense, doing what has to be done, some life forms will eat other life forms, right? That's just part of the natural world. The world decays, earthquakes occur, trees fall over, right? There are natural forces.
Yes.
And this is just sort of the price we pay for living in a material world. And God might allow some of these natural evils, we're calling it, because it gives a chance for improvement. It gives a chance for compassion. It gives a chance for an opportunity for charity. Think of what we have to do with a sick and dying person. This is an opportunity for love to manifest itself.
Yep.
And so maybe God might allow these things. And so that, I think, is in a way is a little bit easier for us to understand, just because price of a natural world, this is the way it is things decay, things fall apart. There are natural forces.
Yes.
Even tornadoes are a result of natural forces that in and of themselves are not evil, but they bring about for us evil things.
Yes.
This is a material world. Maybe harder to understand is, why is there cruelty? Why is there, there's one philosopher, not a Catholic philosopher. In fact, I think he's Anglican. He's certainly English, Richard Swinburne, who posed the question, God might allow, a brother to pick on his little brother, but why would he allow Belsen, one of the death camps in the Second World War, one of the Nazi death camps? Why would God allow that? And that, I think, is probably a tougher nut to crack. But we can talk about that, because I have comments on that. I have thoughts on that.
What is the answer? What I mean, I think that's the crux of the matter. Like, why does God allow that?
Yeah. Well, I think there are two things to look at. One is, of course, God creates, all sorts of laws, all sorts of commandments for us. And why does God do this? Right? God does this because God loves us. And so he says, we saw this, I think, in this past Sunday's readings, right? What does God say to Abraham, right? You be my people, right? Right. And I will be your God, right? So I will give you these rules. Or he says to Moses, here are these rules to live by, right? These are good. If God really does love us, then when God says, much like, when you tell your kid to clean your room, it's good. It's good to clean your room.
Right.
Now, your kid might perceive your commandment to clean your room as a kind of oppression.
This is true.
Right? As this is a burden on me. But this is a sign not of your malevolence, but a fault in your child. I will blame the child on this one. But because the child fails to see that this is actually a loving commandment on your part, because there's all sorts of goods that come from cleaning your room, from having a clean room, the lesson of responsibility. You made a mess, you clean it up, etc. We can all think of all sorts of good things that come from just simply teaching a kid to clean his or her room. So this is an act of love. So when God says, do this, don't do that, I don't know about you, but I often perceive those as burdens. And sometimes I just ignore God and I do what I want to do because I don't like those burdens. But that's my problem. That's not God's problem. That's my failure to live up to my expectations.
Yep.
So even if I can go back to the Benedictine Herbert McCabe, what his example is, someone, and this will be live for us because of the COVID thing, someone has a virus, an illness, and they get on an airplane. They don't know they have this illness, and they spread the illness all over the airplane.
Yep.
Is that person morally to blame?
No.
We would say no, because they didn't know at the time that they had this illness. What about if I knew I had the illness and that it was highly contagious and I got on the airplane? Now am I morally culpable? And most of us would say yes, because you knew you were likely to get people sick and you did it anyway. What if it's like a COVID? What if it's something that's a very serious illness and I go and I don't have a sniffle, I have a serious illness and I wantonly spread it? Now I'm morally culpable. And McCabe's point is that in both cases, the outcome is the same.
Yeah.
You are getting people sick, and maybe let's even say you're killing people from your failure. You're getting on the airplane. People end up dead because you end up on the airplane and you spread some terrible illness.
Yeah.
The outcome is the same, but the moral culpability isn't. Why? Because the real victim in this sense of sin is yourself.
Yeah.
When I do something like I'm getting on the airplane, even though I know I've got this terrible illness that's going to kill people, that's me failing to live up to God's expectations of me. That's a privation.
Yeah.
God has told me what to do, and I refuse to do it. And that is not God's fault that I don't live up to God's expectations of what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
God's made it clear what I'm supposed to do. Even the natural law written on the heart, most of the moral law, you don't even need to believe in God, and you would know these things through reason. You can get to a lot of the moral law from the natural law. So you should know these things. So this is your failure to live up to expectations.
Is there
not God's fault?
Is there an answer to the question in terms of the natural? I mean, like a tornado. None of us have a hand in a tornado, right? Mm-hmm. Like what? How do we answer that question?
All right. Well, again, let's go back to this, and I think the parent analogy is helpful. Oftentimes, what we do is we look at God the Father, and we think of what God the Father is based on what human fathers do.
Yeah.
Probably what we should do is look at that in the opposite, right? That earthly fathers are a mirror of a godly father,
yes.
Right? And let's broaden out to say earthly parenthood.
Yes.
Oftentimes, parents will let their children suffer for some greater good.
Yeah.
You might allow your kid to enter into something that you think they're likely to fail.
Yeah.
Because you think it's better for them, or maybe something where there's a risk they might get hurt. They're going to go on a hike, they're going to athletic event, and they might get hurt, and you allow them to do that. And there's all sorts of reasons why we do that. And maybe God the Father allows certain things to happen through his not his active will, but permissive will. God could stop the tornado, but he permits it anyway. But it gives opportunity for other goods.
I want to break just real quick, Professor. Sure. If you're listening on the radio, we can finish this conversation on our podcast. You can go to your favorite podcast app and catch the rest of our conversation. Until next time, live well. And back to our podcast listeners, we're going to finish our conversation because we're right in the middle of an important point here. So go ahead and finish this one out, Professor.
Well, I was just going to say is that in various ways we can analogize from the way that parents, we often punish our children. We put burdens on our children, what Augustine calls benevolent corrections, right? Even think of with my students, how much would my students do if I never tested them?
Yeah.
Would they read the work? Would they study anything? Some of them would, but honestly, most of us, we can even think back to our student days. Yeah, I probably would have slacked a little bit.
Yeah.
If I knew the teacher said, no matter what, I'm going to get an A and you don't have to study anything and I'm never going to test you. So testing is a kind of pain.
Yes.
But it's a benevolent pain. It's a benevolent harshness, actually, is Augustine's term, benevolent harshness. So maybe there are certain tests, certain what we think of as evils, as burdens that God allows to happen because it is building certain virtues in us, because maybe to give us incentive to improve the world, maybe to take responsibility, right? Maybe a world without any evil would be a world without responsibility, and maybe that's not much of a world. Not one for free people made in God's image. Maybe that's not much of a world. We're not robots. So we're allowed freedom and freedom to do good. Also, there are limits to pain.
Yeah.
There is actually only so much pain that human beings can endure. And that limit is death.
Yes.
At some point, we will die. And so God does put a limit on how much pain we're going to suffer. It's just sometimes God's line is different from our line, what we would like. And if we have a problem with that, that problem is on our side,
Yeah.
not on God's side. If obviously you would want to, go to your book of Job, which you probably should have referenced earlier. The great discourse on evil
Yes.
is the book of Job. And how does Job conclude? Who are you, Job, to question me? I am God. And God maybe draws the line in a different place than we would like to, but there is actually a limit to how much suffering a human person can take, because you will eventually die. And so for all these reasons, God might allow all sorts of evils as opportunities for responsibility, opportunities for compassion, to allow for a free creature to exercise that will and to show love. So there's all sorts of reasons why God might, through permissive will, allow these things to occur.
Well, and what I'm thinking of as you're kind of sharing all these different reasons too, is that God, his end for us is eternity. Sometimes so we can think about, the world coming crashing down with a particular evil or suffering. But when our life is over here on this earth, life isn't over in a certain sense, that that God's horizon is an eternal horizon, and that's what he's aiming for us.
Well, let's bring, because we're in Lenten season, so this is a good lesson for Lenten season. And so, we all know, what does the priest say? I guess there's a couple lines a priest can say to you as you get the ashes on your forehead, but the typical one is, remember that you are ashes, and to ashes you shall return. And so this is a reminder to us, which we sometimes forget, that we are going to die.
Yes.
And so in this sense, a certain amount of suffering is part of life. And I think one of the reasons that we have trouble dealing with this, and I think you and I have talked about this in some ways before, but one of the reasons that especially in our time, we have trouble dealing with evil and suffering, is because it's actually so uncommon.
Yeah.
We have so many ways of avoiding these things. It's not, death is not as common, especially, even I'll pick a random day. 150 years ago, death of a child would be a relatively common thing. You certainly, at a certain age, would have known a child who died.
Yeah.
Right. People died younger. Obviously, living with physical pain was quite common. Right. The idea of, one of my favorite things about the modern world is dentistry.
Yes.
So even 120 years ago, your typical person would have either, at Chris's age and my age, as I am at middle age, and Chris is rapidly approaching middle age. You get to our age, you would have one of two things. You would have either be living in constant mouth pain, or you would have had no teeth. Because how do you deal with tooth pain?
Take them out.
Yank it out. Yank it out. It's the only option, is to yank it out, and that's what you're left with. So we have great dentistry. We have antibiotics. We have anesthesia.
Nobody dies from appendicitis anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I was just relating this to my students last week. Is how many of you worry about polio? Right. I know people, and maybe you do too, Chris, that are old enough to remember. They say, here in South Dakota, don't go swimming in the lake in August.
Oh,
because that's when the polio bacteria is most prevalent, in the hot weather, in these sort of tepid lakes, right? They don't move. What's the word? I've lost the word. Not tepid.
Stagnant.
Stagnant. That's what I'm
right.
thinking of. These there are these non-movable waters, and so you don't go swimming in the lake or in the slough in August, because that's when you get polio.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks about that. And this is a good thing, but the only point is that I think these are all good things, and put me down as pro dentistry, pro antibiotic, pro anesthesia, pro vaccination. I don't want to get into politics of in general, pro vaccination. I like the polio vaccine. I'm all for it. But it brings about a mentality that we have, is that everything comes relatively easy.
Yeah.
Right. What's the biggest health problem in America today? that were fat and overweight.
Heart disease, right?
This is not the diabetes, right?
Right.
This is not the problem that people had. Well, even 50 years ago, this was not the problem. Is we eat too much, we're overweight, we don't do enough, and so it's easy for suffering to be abstract from us. And when there is suffering, surely there's a pill I can take, right? Or there's an app for this, right? Isn't there an app for this suffering? There's something on my phone that can solve this problem for me. There's got to be some technical solution to every problem. And maybe there isn't. Maybe we just sort of have to live with the fact, and I think that not maybe, it is,
yes,
that suffering is part of life, and part of being a mature Christian is coming to grips with that. And I think it's harder for us in the 21st century, because it's so easy for us to point to technical solutions that have alleviated a lot of suffering that would have been common 50 years ago, 100 years ago, that now are easily dealt with. So I think that we have to think harder, and maybe that sign of the cross on our foreheads on Ash Wednesday is even more prescient for us to remind ourselves that suffering is part of life.
Amen. And that's really, I think, the gift of faith, because at some point we're all going to have that realization that we can't technology our way out of every suffering. Yeah. And that's the gift of faith. We, approach a priest, approach a brother or sister Christian, just in a spirit of like, I've got this struggle. And that's where the faith really can just illuminate the experience of suffering and bring out a greater good from it.
It just maybe this is the last point we should make, but I look at the world today. I look at young people today, of which I'm around young people all the time. I think you and I have talked about this before, Chris. Is that the number one problem for our young people today? The number one suffering is not physical suffering.
Yes,
it's spiritual suffering.
That's
Their
right.
physical needs are by and large taken care of. We all know there are obvious exceptions to that, but on the whole, materially and physically, our young people want for virtually nothing.
That's right.
What they have is spiritual suffering. And so looking for technical solutions to their problems hasn't satisfied them.
Yes.
And so this is what happens when we lose this. The great thing about remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return. It's supposed to sober us up.
Yeah.
And say you need to focus on first things.
Yes.
Right. And that first thing is you are going to die. What's going to happen to you when you die? Are you right with the Lord, as they used to say? Have you paid attention to the most important things? And so as we encounter suffering in the world, which I tried to articulate that yet it's not God's fault.
Yep.
Moral evil, it's our fault.
Yes.
Natural evil is simply part of living in a natural material world.
Yep.
But this allows us a way. It's an avenue to God. It's a way of even when I'm hungry, my stomach hurts.
Yes.
And it does that to tell me to do a good thing, eat. Right. When I'm sleepy, I have this physical manifestation. Oh, I'm sleepy. It's because it's telling me do a good thing, go to sleep. Right. When my tooth hurts, it's telling me go to the dentist. If I'm feeling spiritual pain, it's telling me something.
Yes.
Right. Or really any kind of pain is telling you something. That physical pain is telling you you're going to die. So maybe you need to think about eternal life. Spiritual pain is telling us, or psychological pain, if you want to use a more therapeutic term, but I prefer spiritual pain, and spiritual anxiety is telling you need to get something right in your life, and you need to direct yourself towards something other than, is there, maybe if I just made more money, maybe if my doctor gave me a pill, and sometimes those do work, and maybe if I have this app on my phone, that will solve this problem. But ultimately, the phone, the money, the pills are not going to solve our most important problems.
And that is the problem of evil. Dr. John Schaff, thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
And thank you, as always, dear listeners, for tuning in. Love to hear feedback. sdcatholicconference.org. You can click contact us, drop us a line. Until next time, live well.